If you're anything like me, you've often wondered how something as cruel and enduring as slavery could take root in a nation that spoke so often and so eloquently of equality and liberty. In A People's History of the United States, Howard Zinn asks that same question in Chapter 2, Drawing the Color Line. He reminds us that racism in America wasn't born out of nature. It was built piece by piece through deliberate choices about power, profit, and fear. Hi, if you don't know me, I'm Greg, a humanities professor who talks about history and cultural studies. I'm interested in the stories beyond the surface and the history of people and places and what they tell us about the American experience and the human condition. This is my series, chapter by chapter. And this month, we're talking about Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. In each episode, we summarize the big ideas of the chapter and identify lessons we should take away from the reading. This episode is Chapter 2, Drawing the Color Line. Following the video, join the conversation in the comments about the chapter and Zinn's approach to American history. Zinn begins by tracing the origins of the Atlantic slave trade, showing how European demand for land and labor collided with the realities of the New World. When colonists discovered that indigenous populations were dying from disease and resisting enslavement, they turned to Africa, where existing systems of captivity and trade were transformed into a vast, brutal economy of human trafficking. Zinn is careful to note that African slavery did not begin as a matter of color alone. Early colonial Virginia had a mixed labor force. European indentured servants and Africans who sometimes worked side by side and in rare cases even shared small freedoms. But over time, the English class, the English ruling class, especially in the southern colonies, realized something dangerous. White and black laborers, when united, could rebel together. Bacon's rebellion in 1676 made that crystal clear. Planters and governors saw a new solution: divide the laboring class along racial lines, granting poor whites just enough privilege to feel separate and superior, while consigning Africans and their descendants to permanent bondage. That, Zinn argues, is how America's color line was drawn, not as an accident of prejudice, but as a tool of control. Racism became the glue that held a deeply unequal system together. Laws hardened over the next century, forbidding interracial marriage, restricting movement, denying education, and defining slavery as inheritable and absolute. Zinn doesn't ignore the brutality itself, the Middle Passage, the whippings, the psychological terror of families torn apart at the auction block. But he insists we see the twisted logic behind it. Slavery, he says, was not simply cruelty. It was a system designed to make wealth appear moral and oppression seem natural. He also points out the resistance that followed every act of domination. Enslaved people rebelled, fled, preserved culture, told stories, and passed on secret maps to freedom. Their endurance, Zinn reminds us, was not passive survival, but active defiance, a refusal to let dehumanization have the last word. From this foundation, Zinn connects slavery to the broader shape of American history. The creation of race-based slavery produced a racial ideology that would long outlive the institution itself, justifying segregation, exploitation, and exclusion for centuries to come. In other words, the color line did not end with emancipation. It simply changed its forms. So, what lessons should we take from this chapter? Well, first, Zinn teaches that racism has a history, and therefore it has a cause. It isn't innate. It was constructed to protect privilege. Recognizing that truth strips racism of its mystery and exposes it as something human beings created, and therefore it can be dismantled. Second, division is a strategy, not an inevitability. When people in power fear unity among the poor or the working class, they create walls between them. Zinn's color line was an early blueprint for how inequality sustains itself. The lesson is that solidarity is always the most radical threat to oppression. Third, language and law can disguise injustice. Colonial statutes and religious justifications dressed slavery in the rhetoric of order and civilization. Today, Zinn's warning still stands. Every generation must learn to see when words like security, progress, or prosperity mask systems of exclusion. Fourth, resistance is as old as oppression itself. Even in bondage, people found ways to fight, remember, and hope. Their resistance reshaped American identity long before formal freedom arrived. The lesson here is that moral courage often begins in the darkest corners of history. And finally, Zinn reminds us that to study the past honestly is an act of repair. We can't change where the color line was drawn, but we can understand who drew it and why. And we can commit to removing it in our own time and bending the arc toward justice. So when we read a people's history, chapter 2 doesn't just tell us how racism began. It shows us how power hides inside the stories we inherit. Zinn's challenge is simple but profound. See clearly, feel deeply, and never mistake cruelty for inevitability. Because the color line, like every human boundary, was drawn by hand. And what was drawn by hand can also be erased. Remember, Zinn's method throughout a people's history of the United States is to turn the lens of history upside down, to tell the story not through presidents, generals, and wealthy elites, but through the eyes of those who endured the cost of their decisions. In this chapter, by tracing how racism was deliberately constructed to divide the poor and justify slavery, he reveals one of his central arguments, that inequality in America has always depended on separation, keeping the oppressed from seeing their shared struggle. Chapter 2 shows how race was used to fracture solidarity before it could form. In the next chapter, Zinn turns to the other side of that story, to the white indentured servants, laborers, and the early poor of the colonial America. Chapter 3, Persons of Mean and Vile Condition, continues his search for the roots of rebellion, exploring how class anger and resistance began to shape the first cracks in the system of control that still defines so much of our history. What are your thoughts about this chapter? How does Zinn's method of turning history upside down change your thinking or your perspective on the subject? If you enjoy this type of journey, would you please like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already? Join us for more journeys through history.